Some people stop looking human long before they stop breathing. The brass auction bell rang once through the underground market, low and heavy like a church bell buried beneath steel. Ethan Cole barely looked up from the hood of his coat as he pushed through the crowd. The recycled air inside Dock 9 smelled like engine grease, wet concrete, and overheated wiring. Somewhere deeper in the station, mining drills vibrated through the floor in slow, rhythmic pulses that made the metal railings hum. 12-hour shifts in the cobalt tunnels had left his lungs raw again. Every breath scratched on the way down. He reached into his pocket and felt the thin stack of credits folded beside the prescription slip for his inhaler refill. Not enough for both this week. Again. Above the auction platform, neon signs flickered through layers of industrial dust, casting blue and red streaks across tired faces. Most people gathered there weren't wealthy buyers. They were workers, miners, cargo haulers, men too exhausted to care where the station got its labor as long as shipments kept moving and oxygen stayed cheap. Ethan hated this part of the station, but the pharmacy closed early on weekends, and Dock 9 was the only shortcut left open after curfew inspection started. Lot 17, the auctioneer barked suddenly. Rare northern sector female. Educated. Healthy. Compliant enough. Scattered laughter rolled through the crowd. Ethan kept walking at first. Then he heard the sound. Chains. Not loud. Just a soft metallic drag against steel flooring. Something about it made him stop. The platform lights brightened with a harsh electric buzz, revealing a young alien woman standing beneath them. She was taller than Ethan expected, though painfully thin beneath the oversized gray coat hanging from her shoulders. Pale turquoise skin caught the neon glow in soft fragments, almost silver near her cheekbones. Her white hair had been cut unevenly near one side, as if someone had done it carelessly with a utility blade. A glowing restraint collar circled her neck. Matching cuffs bound her wrists in front of her. But it wasn't the chains that held the room still for a moment. It was the way she stood, straight-backed, chin lifted slightly, like the station hadn't broken her yet. Ethan noticed several buyers lose interest immediately. She wasn't smiling, wasn't begging, didn't lower her eyes the way frightened people usually did. One of the guards shoved her shoulder impatiently. "Look alive," he muttered. She regained her balance without a word. Ethan should have kept moving. He knew that. He was 38 years old, coughing blood into sink drains twice a month. Living above a failing bakery he could barely afford to heat. He had no business standing in a slave auction watching strangers ruin his night. But then the girl opened one hand slightly, and Ethan saw it. A medal. Small, tarnished bronze hanging from a faded ribbon. She kept it hidden tightly in her palm, like it was the last thing in the galaxy nobody had managed to take from her. Defective attitude, the auctioneer announced with a grin. Former military arts division from the Valoran territories. Refused reassignment after the border collapse. Multiple citations for noncompliance. More laughter. Somebody near Ethan scoffed. "So she's trouble and hungry." "Half the station is," another voice answered. The alien girl didn't react. Her eyes stayed fixed somewhere above the crowd, distant and exhausted all at once. Ethan couldn't explain why that bothered him more than the chains did. Maybe because he recognized the look. The kind people got when life kept taking pieces from them until feeling anything became too expensive. The auctioneer stepped closer to her and grabbed the medal between two fingers. "Cute little souvenir," he mocked. Maybe she thinks it still means something. For the first time, emotion crossed her face. Not fear, not anger, just shame. Quiet and immediate. She lowered her head barely an inch. And somehow that tiny movement hit Ethan harder than the guard's chains, or the filthy room, or the coughing fit rising in his chest. Around him, nobody spoke. Nobody moved. The station kept humming. Machinery. Ventilation fans. Distant mining drills chewing through rock miles below their feet. Humanity reduced to background noise. Then the auctioneer raised his voice again. Starting bid at 8,000 credits. Ethan looked down at the prescription slip in his hand. Then back at the girl gripping that medal like it was the final proof she had once belonged to herself. The crowd smelled weakness faster than blood. Ethan heard the bidding begin before he even realized he had stopped walking. 8,000. Someone near the front called lazily. 9. Another answered. The numbers climbed without energy, more habit than desire. Most buyers in Dock 9 were not looking for people. They were looking for labor contracts they could overwork until the next shipment arrived. The alien girl stood motionless beneath the white overhead lights, while voices tossed prices at her, like inventory tags. Her eyes remained fixed somewhere beyond the room, distant and empty in a way Ethan recognized too well. He had seen miners stare like that after cave-ins, after debt notices, after learning nobody was coming to help. A cough tightened inside his chest again. Ethan pressed a fist against his ribs until the burning passed. The auctioneer grinned wider each time another bid echoed through the hall. Strong lungs. Educated. Minimal food intake. Very manageable maintenance costs. Laughter rolled through the room again. Ethan hated the sound of it. He glanced back toward the station exit. 30 yards away. If he left now, none of this followed him home. He could still buy medicine. Still make rent on the bakery another month. Still wake up tomorrow with only his own problems to carry. Then the guard beside the platform yanked the girl's chain forward too hard. The metal slipped from her hand and hit the metal floor with a tiny sharp clink. The entire room heard it. She reacted instantly. Not with panic. With something worse. She dropped to one knee and reached for it before the guard's boot could slide it away. The movement exposed bruised skin beneath the restraint cuffs around her wrists. Careful, the guard muttered coldly. Property should know its place. Ethan watched her fingers close around the metal again. She held it against her chest afterward, like she could still protect whatever memory lived inside it. The auctioneer rolled his eyes dramatically. Sentimental too. You lucky people are getting the full package tonight. 10,000, someone called from the back. Ethan frowned immediately. Too high. Nobody spent that kind of money on exhausted station labor unless they had other plans. The girl must have realized it too because her breathing changed. Barely noticeable. But Ethan saw the tension pull across her shoulders beneath the gray coat. Fear finally found its way through the numbness. A man beside Ethan leaned closer to his friend and chuckled. Poor thing just realized somebody actually wants her. Ethan felt something cold settle behind his ribs. Not anger exactly. Worse. Shame. The kind that arrived when decent people stayed quiet too long. He looked down at the folded prescription paper still trapped in his hand. The edges had softened from sweat. $36 left in his account after rent cleared yesterday. The inhaler refill alone cost nearly half. Rational people walked away from impossible situations. Rational people survived. Another bid climbed higher. 11,000. The auctioneer clapped his hands together excitedly. Now we are talking. The girl lowered her eyes at last. Not submissively, just tired. Ethan suddenly wondered how long it had been since someone had spoken to her without trying to own something from her. The thought hit harder than he expected. Around him, Dock 9 continued its endless mechanical heartbeat. Ventilation fans rattled overhead. Cargo lifts groaned somewhere below the station floor. A freight siren wailed in the distance for incoming or shipments from Sector C. Life moving forward while one frightened girl stood beneath fluorescent lights waiting to learn what kind of misery came next. Ethan exhaled slowly through his nose. Then he raised his hand. The auctioneer spotted him immediately. New interest. Ethan's voice came out rough from dust and exhaustion. 12,000. The room shifted. Several heads turned toward him at once. Nobody in mining coveralls usually bid that high. The auctioneer squinted down at him with amused surprise. You sure about that, miner? Ethan looked up at the girl for the first time since the bidding started. Up close, her turquoise skin looked almost pale beneath the station lights. Exhaustion sat behind her eyes like something permanent. But she was still standing straight, still holding that medal. Ethan swallowed once. Yeah, he said quietly. I am sure. For a few seconds, nobody said anything. The station noise faded beneath the weight of silence spreading through Dock 9. Ethan could feel dozens of eyes turning toward him beneath the flickering neon lights. The auctioneer blinked once, surprised enough to lose his rehearsed smile. 12,000, he repeated slowly. From the miner? Scattered laughter followed, thinner this time. Uncertain. Ethan kept his hand raised. His shoulder ached from the day's shift, and cold dust still clung to the seams of his jacket. He looked nothing like the men who usually bought people in places like this. That was probably why the room suddenly felt uncomfortable. The auctioneer leaned over the platform rail. Friend, you sure your account can survive generosity like that? More chuckles drifted through the crowd. Ethan ignored them. His pulse hammered steadily in his ears now, louder than the ventilation fans overhead. He had not planned this. 5 minutes ago, he was calculating whether he could stretch Kent's soup through the weekend. Now he was standing in a slave market gambling away nearly every credit he had left. Rational people survived. But rational people also learned how to look away. Ethan was tired of doing that. "Do we have 13? The auctioneer called. A long pause answered him. The wealthy bidder in the back studied the girl for another moment before shrugging and stepping away toward the drink stalls. Just like that, interest disappeared. Not because she lacked value. Because cruelty was usually lazy. The room relaxed again once entertainment ended. Buyers turned back toward their conversations. Someone lit a cheap vapor stick near the cargo doors. Another man laughed about refinery quotas. Life moving on. Ethan lowered his hand slowly. The auctioneer sighed with exaggerated disappointment. "Well then, congratulations, miner. Lot 17 is yours." The word hit Ethan harder than expected. Yours. He hated it immediately. A guard descended the side steps, carrying a thin digital contract tablet. "Thumbprint authorization," he muttered. Ethan stared at the glowing screen. "Owner transfer confirmed. Property designation active upon payment." The alien girl stood only a few feet away now, close enough for Ethan to notice the exhaustion hidden beneath her composure. Tiny tremors ran through her restrained hands. She still held the metal tightly between her fingers. She had probably seen this moment happen before. Buyers signing papers while pretending not to notice fear standing in front of them. Ethan looked back at the contract, then up at the guard. "Change it," he said. The guard frowned. "What?" "The ownership registration." Ethan's voice remained calm, but something inside the room shifted again when he spoke. "Put the release papers in her name." Silence. Even the auctioneer stopped moving. "Excuse me." Ethan pointed toward the screen. "Transfer the payment. Clear the debt record. Register her as independent." The guard stared at him like he had spoken another language. "You are buying a labor contract." "No," Ethan answered quietly. "I am ending one." A few people in the crowd laughed nervously. Others simply watched. The auctioneer recovered first, forcing amusement back into his expression. "Miner, that is not usually how this works." Ethan reached into his coat and removed the worn credit chip from his pocket. Every overtime shift, every skipped meal, every repair he had postponed on the bakery heating system. Years of surviving one paycheck at a time rested inside that tiny metal square. He placed it into the guard's hand anyway. Then maybe the system needs new rules. The alien girl finally looked directly at him. Her eyes were not bright like the station advertisements or polished like wealthy diplomats from the inner systems. They looked tired, careful, as if hope itself had become dangerous. Ethan saw confusion there too. She had prepared herself to be owned again, not released. The guard muttered something under his breath and unlocked the wrist restraints first. Soft metallic clicks echoed across the platform. The girl stared down at her own hands afterward like she had forgotten what freedom weighed. Then the collar around her neck powered down with a low electronic hum. Red warning lights faded into darkness. Nobody in Dock 9 moved. Nobody joked anymore. The girl lifted one trembling hand slowly to her throat, touching the place where the restraint had rested against her skin. Ethan looked away to give her privacy. Somehow that simple gesture made her breathing hitch harder than the chains had. "You are free to go," the guard muttered awkwardly. The words sounded foreign even to him. The alien girl swallowed once. Then she looked back at Ethan with quiet disbelief filling her pale silver eyes. "Why?" she asked softly. Ethan coughed into his fist before answering. His lungs burned again from the mine dust. "Because," he said, voice rough with exhaustion, "nobody should have to earn the right to belong to themselves." The station felt colder after the collar came off. Ethan noticed it while they walked through Dock 9 together beneath rows of flickering industrial lights. Nobody stopped them. Nobody tried to talk to the girl anymore. People simply moved aside quietly, pretending not to stare. Freedom made crowds uncomfortable, especially when they had spent years accepting chains as normal. Ethan kept both hands buried inside his coat pockets as they crossed the freight corridor leading toward the upper transit ramps. His cough had settled into a dull ache behind his lungs again. Fine dust from the mines still clung to the creases around his eyes and the seams of his boots. Beside him, the alien girl moved carefully, like she expected someone to grab her shoulder at any second and drag her back. Every time station security drones floated overhead, her posture tightened slightly. Ethan noticed she still carried the bronze medal hidden inside her hand. She had not let go of it once. "You got somewhere to go?" he asked finally. His voice echoed softly off the metal corridor walls. The girl remained quiet for a moment. No, one word. Calm. Empty. Ethan nodded slowly like he understood. Truthfully, he did. Dock 9 was full of people with nowhere left to return to. A maintenance tram rattled overhead, shaking rust dust loose from the ceiling supports. Somewhere farther down the station, warning sirens announced another incoming or shipment from the southern tunnels. Life continuing. Machines running. Men working themselves sick beneath the planet while the wealthy sectors stayed warm and clean overhead. Ethan guided her toward a narrow elevator platform tucked behind an abandoned shipping office. The call button flickered weakly under his thumb before the old lift finally groaned awake. "Where are we going?" she asked quietly. "Home." The answer slipped out naturally enough that Ethan almost regretted it afterward. The girl looked at him carefully then, silver eyes searching his face as if trying to understand what kind of person casually invited strangers home from slave auctions. Ethan avoided eye contact and stepped into the elevator first. The lift climbed slowly through the outer levels of the station, rattling hard enough to make loose bolts tremble inside the walls. Through the scratched observation window, endless layers of industrial housing passed beneath them. Stacked apartment cubes, steam vents, cargo rails glowing red through drifting fog. The kind of place where people stopped dreaming because survival already took everything they had. "You should know," Ethan said after a while. "It is not much." Neither was the cell. Her voice carried no bitterness. Somehow that made it worse. The elevator opened onto Sector 12 nearly 4 minutes later. Warm air drifted through the corridor carrying the faint smell of yeast and cinnamon beneath the station's usual metal and smoke scent. The girl slowed immediately. Confusion crossed her face. Ethan noticed it and almost smiled for the first time all night. "Bakery downstairs," he explained. "My mother used to run it before she passed." They walked beneath a faded sign that read Cole Family Bread in peeling gold paint. Half the letters no longer lit up. Inside the dark front windows, rows of empty shelves rested beneath dust-covered display lights. The station economy had nearly killed small businesses years ago. Ethan still kept the bakery running 3 mornings a week anyway, mostly because he could not bring himself to let it die completely. He unlocked the side entrance and pushed open the heavy door. Warmth greeted them immediately. Not luxury, just heat from old pipes and the lingering smell of fresh bread baked earlier that morning. The girl stopped in the doorway. Ethan set his coat on a chair near the kitchen counter and switched on the overhead lights. The apartment above the bakery was small and worn down, but clean. Old wooden cabinets, narrow staircase, faded family photos hanging crookedly near the refrigerator. Human life in all its ordinary exhaustion. "Bathroom is through there," Ethan said gently. "Closet has spare blankets." She did not move. Her eyes remained fixed on the room itself. The table, the old couch, the kettle resting on the stove. Ethan suddenly realized what she was seeing. No restraints, no guards, no locked cage doors. Just a home. "You can leave whenever you want," he added carefully. "Door is not locked." The girl looked at him again then. Really looked at him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked softly. Ethan walked to the stove and filled the kettle with water before answering. "Because somebody should have done it sooner." The kettle began to hiss quietly as the heating coils glowed orange beneath it. Behind him, he heard the smallest sound imaginable. Fabric shifting. A metal finally slipping from trembling fingers onto a kitchen table where nobody was trying to take it away. The old bakery woke up before the station did. Ethan stood alone in the kitchen at 4:30 in the morning while pale industrial light leaked through the frosted front windows downstairs. The station beyond Sector 12 still slept beneath layers of steel and steam, but inside the bakery, warmth slowly pushed back the cold. Dough rested beneath cloth-covered trays along the counter, while the ancient oven groaned softly as it heated. Ethan rolled his sore shoulders once and rubbed flour from his hands onto his jeans. His lungs hurt less when the bakery was warm. Maybe because this place still smelled like home instead of metal dust and machine oil. He measured yeast into a steel bowl by instinct, movements practiced. Enough to survive exhaustion. His mother used to say bread was the closest thing poor people had to hope, because even broken lives paused when something warm came out of the oven. Ethan had not believed her at 16. At 38, he understood exactly what she meant. Behind him, the apartment remained quiet. He had expected the alien girl to leave during the night. Rational people would have. Trusting strangers in Dock 9 usually got you hurt. Yet sometime around dawn, he heard the faint creak of the upstairs hallway floorboards. Ethan glanced over his shoulder as she appeared slowly near the kitchen entrance, wrapped in one of the oversized blankets from the closet. Her white hair looked damp from a shower. Cleaner now, softer somehow beneath the kitchen lights. She paused immediately when she noticed him watching her. Ethan pretended not to notice the instinctive tension that tightened her posture. "You can sleep more," he said while kneading dough against the counter. "Still early." She looked toward the oven instead. "I smell bread." Ethan almost smiled. "Yeah, that tends to happen in bakeries." For a second, confusion crossed her expression before she realized he was joking. The reaction disappeared quickly, but Ethan caught it anyway. A small crack forming in the armor she kept around herself. He motioned toward the kitchen table. "There is coffee if you drink it." "I do not know." Fair answer. He poured hot water into a chipped ceramic mug and set it across from her along with a smaller plate, holding 2 fresh rolls still steaming from the oven. The smell filled the room immediately. Butter, wheat, warm sugar. The alien girl froze slightly when the plate touched the table. Ethan noticed her eyes move from the bread to him and back again, cautious like she expected hidden conditions attached to kindness. He understood that look too. "You do not owe me for breakfast," he said quietly. "Nobody should owe somebody for bread." She lowered herself carefully into the chair, but did not touch the food right away. Instead, she studied the steam rising from it, as if trying to remember something. Ethan returned to shaping dough near the counter, giving her space. Silence settled naturally between them. Not uncomfortable, just tired, honest. The old oven hissed softly, while distant pipes rattled somewhere inside the station walls. Outside, a cargo train roared past Sector 12 carrying ore from the lower mines. The galaxy continuing its endless machinery while one small kitchen stayed warm against it. After nearly a minute, Ethan finally heard it. The faint sound of bread breaking apart. He glanced sideways carefully. The girl ate slowly at first, almost mechanically. Tiny pieces, measured bites, like someone used to making food last longer than hunger did. Ethan noticed her free hand resting near the bronze medal beside the plate. She still kept it close even here. "You have a name?" he asked gently. She swallowed before answering. "Lyra." "Ethan." She nodded once like she had already known. They fell quiet again. Ethan worked flour into another batch while Lyra continued eating in careful silence. Halfway through the second roll, she suddenly stopped. Her eyes remained fixed downward at the table. Ethan frowned slightly. Something wrong. For several seconds, she said nothing. Then finally, very softly, "Nobody has watched me eat before without trying to take it away." Ethan felt the words land somewhere deep behind his ribs. He looked down at the dough beneath his hands because suddenly meeting her eyes felt too difficult. Outside the bakery windows, station lights flickered weakly through drifting steam clouds. Somewhere far below them, miners were already descending into the tunnels for morning shift. Men coughing dust into recycled oxygen systems so the upper sectors could stay rich and warm. Ethan brushed flour from his fingers slowly. "Well," he said quietly, "you are safe here." Lyra looked at him then. Really looked at him. Not with fear this time. Not even confusion. Just fragile disbelief. And for the first time since Ethan had seen her standing beneath those auction lights, she took another bite of bread without looking over her shoulder first. 3 days passed before Lyra finally stopped flinching at footsteps. Ethan noticed it on a Thursday morning while carrying flour sacks up from the bakery storage room. Normally, any sudden sound made her shoulders tense immediately, like her body expected punishment before her mind could think. But this time, she simply looked up from the kitchen table where she sat repairing a loose seam in the blanket he had given her. A small thing, barely noticeable, yet somehow it felt bigger than words. Outside the apartment windows, freezing rain streaked across Sector 12 in silver lines. Storm season had settled over the mining colony early this year, coating the lower station walls with layers of ice that made transport routes dangerous after dark. Ethan's joints hurt worse whenever cold fronts rolled through. He tried not to show it while lifting another crate toward the counter. "You should let me help," Lyra said quietly. Ethan shook his head. Doctor's orders. She frowned slightly. You have a doctor? No, he adjusted the heavy crate against his shoulder. That is why I can ignore him. A faint sound escaped her then. Soft. Almost surprised. Ethan realized a second later it was laughter. Real laughter. Tiny and uncertain, like she had forgotten how it worked. The sound disappeared quickly, but it lingered in the kitchen anyway. Warm. Human. Ethan pretended not to notice the way her expression shifted afterward, embarrassed by her own reaction. He busied himself organizing bread trays instead. Some moments needed space to survive. By late afternoon, the bakery downstairs filled with the usual workers finishing shift rotations. Tired miners lined up beneath flickering ceiling lights, with dust still covering their boots and jackets. Most bought cheap soup and day-old bread because it stretched farther than station rations. Ethan worked the counter while Lyra stayed upstairs, though he occasionally caught glimpses of her through the staircase railing, watching quietly from the shadows. Not hiding exactly, just learning. Around 7 o'clock, business slowed enough for Ethan to wipe down the counters and finally sit for the first time in hours. His lungs burned sharply tonight. Too much flour dust mixed with mine residue. He coughed hard into a kitchen towel before pouring himself coffee. Gone lukewarm hours. Earlier. You should rest, Lyra said from the doorway. Ethan glanced up. She had changed into one of his old station sweaters rolled at the sleeves to fit her narrower frame. The oversized fabric swallowed her hands almost completely. Somehow the sight hurt more than the chains had. Bakery does not run itself, he muttered. Neither do broken lungs. Ethan snorted softly. You sound like my mother. Lyra stepped farther inside, silver eyes drifting toward the old family photographs hanging beside the refrigerator. One picture showed Ethan at 16 covered in flour beside a smiling woman with tired eyes and the same crooked nose. Another showed the bakery before the station economy collapsed. Full shelves. Bright lights. Hope still alive inside the walls. She taught you all this? Lyra asked. Ethan nodded slowly. She said bread mattered because hungry people stopped believing in tomorrow after a while. Lyra looked down at the bronze medal resting against her sweater collar where she now wore it openly. My people used to believe art served the same purpose. Ethan leaned back slightly. Used to. Silence stretched between them. Outside, freight engines howled through the frozen station tunnels. Lyra's fingers tightened around the metal unconsciously. Ethan noticed the movement immediately. You do not have to talk about it, he said gently. She remained quiet long enough that he thought she would refuse again. Then finally she spoke. The medal was awarded after the Southern evacuation. Her voice sounded distant now, pulled backward through memory. I worked in cultural recovery during the border wars. Music archives. Historical records. Children separated from families. Ethan listened without interrupting. When the government lost funding after the collapse, they changed the breeding laws. She swallowed once. Citizens unable or unwilling to meet reproductive quotas became labor assets instead. Ethan felt cold settle into his chest despite the bakery heat. They sold teachers, artists, historians, caretakers. Lyra's eyes lowered. Anyone considered unnecessary. The kitchen fell silent except for the hum of old refrigeration units and distant rain, striking the bakery windows. Ethan looked at her for a long moment before speaking. You are not unnecessary. Lyra froze slightly at the words. Not because they sounded dramatic, because they sounded honest. Ethan stood slowly from the table and crossed toward the oven to check tomorrow morning's dough. Behind him, Lyra remained perfectly still in the warm kitchen light. For years, entire systems had taught her that human worth depended on usefulness, productivity, ownership, compliance. Yet somehow the exhausted miner coughing blood into dish towels had looked at her and seen a person first. And that frightened her far more than chains ever had. The knocking started just after closing time. 3 heavy strikes against the bakery door. Slow, deliberate. Ethan looked up immediately from the register counter while the last customer hurried out into the freezing station rain. Outside the front windows, Sector 12 glowed beneath blurred neon reflections and drifting steam clouds rising from underground heat vents. Most businesses had already shut their lights off for the night. Nobody knocked on bakery doors after 10 unless something had gone wrong. Ethan felt it in his chest before he even moved. Upstairs, floorboards creaked softly. Lyra had heard it too. The knocking came again. Harder this time. Ethan crossed the bakery slowly, wiping flour from his hands onto his apron. His lungs still hurt from the mines earlier, and exhaustion dragged at his shoulders like wet concrete. Through the fogged glass beside the entrance, he spotted two dark figures standing beneath the station lights outside. Heavy coats. Security boots. Not customers. Ethan unlocked the door halfway. Cold air rushed inside immediately, carrying rain and machine smoke with it. The taller man smiled without warmth. Ethan Cole. Ethan leaned against the doorway carefully. Bakery is closed. Good thing we are not here for bread. The second man held up a small digital tablet displaying station contract records. Ethan recognized the auction registry seal instantly. Something cold settled behind his ribs. You filed ownership termination paperwork for a Valoran labor asset 3 nights ago, the taller man continued. There appears to be some confusion regarding transfer legality. Ethan kept his expression flat, even while tension tightened through him. No confusion. Funny, the man said. The broker disagrees. Rainwater dripped steadily from the station awning overhead. Somewhere deeper in Sector 12, a maintenance siren echoed through the tunnels before fading again into machinery noise. Ethan noticed both men glancing past him toward the staircase inside the bakery. Looking for her. The contract was paid in full, Ethan said quietly. She is free. The taller man gave a small shrug. Depends who you ask. Upstairs, silence. Too much silence. Ethan knew Lyra was listening. The broker lost valuable property, the second man added. People do not like losing money on this station. Ethan crossed his arms slowly. Then maybe they should stop selling people. That earned him a tired smile instead of anger. Somehow that felt worse. Listen carefully, Minor, the taller man said. Nobody wants trouble. But station management cannot have labor systems collapsing because one exhausted baker suddenly developed a conscience. Ethan almost laughed at that. Conscience. As if it were some rare disease. So what happens now, he asked. The man tapped the contract tablet once. Simple. You surrender the Valoran female voluntarily. Broker reinstates the labor agreement. No penalties. Ethan stared at him for several long seconds while rain hammered softly against the station windows behind them. The bakery still smelled faintly of cinnamon and warm dough from the evening batch cooling in the kitchen. Home. Safe. Human. Everything Doc 9 was not. Ethan suddenly realized how fragile all of it actually was. No, he answered quietly. The taller man sighed through his nose like he had expected disappointment. You are already behind on oxygen taxes for this sector, Ethan. That got his attention immediately. What? Station records are public. The man tilted his head slightly. One complaint from the labor board, and your bakery loses heat allocation priority by morning. Ethan felt anger rise sharp and immediate beneath his exhaustion. Not fear for himself. Fear for everyone living on this block. Old people. Children. Workers already coughing themselves sick through winter shifts. Sector 12 barely stayed warm during storm months as it was. You would freeze an entire neighborhood over one girl, he asked coldly. The man's expression barely changed. This station freezes people over unpaid parking fines. Upstairs, another floorboard creaked softly. Ethan knew Lyra had heard every word. The taller man stepped backward into the rain. You have until tomorrow night to think clearly. Then both figures disappeared into the drifting station fog without another word. Ethan shut the bakery door slowly and locked it. For a long moment, he just stood there listening to the building settle around him. Pipes humming. Refrigerators buzzing. Rain striking old glass. Finally, he looked up toward the staircase. Lyra stood halfway down, now wrapped in the oversized sweater again, silver eyes filled with something worse than fear. Guilt. I can leave, she said softly. Ethan closed his eyes for one exhausted second before answering. No, they will hurt this place because of me. They already hurt places like this, Ethan replied quietly. That is how people like them survive. Lyra's hands tightened around the bronze medal hanging at her throat. You should not risk everything for someone you barely know. Ethan looked around the bakery slowly. The worn tables. The cracked tile floors. The fading photographs on the wall. His mother's bakery surviving one impossible year after another because somebody kept choosing kindness even when the world called it foolish. Then he looked back at Lyra. Maybe, he said softly, I am just tired of watching decent people get traded away while everyone else pretends it is normal. By the next evening, word had spread across Sector 12. Ethan noticed at the moment he stepped outside before sunrise to clear ice from the bakery entrance. People watched him differently now. Not openly hostile. Worse, careful, curious. Miners heading toward early shift slowed slightly as they passed the storefront. A cargo mechanic pretending to smoke near the tram rail glanced toward the upstairs apartment. Windows twice before moving on. Even regular customers spoke quieter inside the bakery that morning. Doc 9 never kept secrets long, especially not stories involving freed labor contracts. Ethan worked through the day anyway. Bread dough, coffee, soup stocks simmering beside the ovens. Routine kept panic manageable. His lungs hurt badly today. The cold front pressing against the station walls had worsened the dust inflammation again, and every deep breath scraped like sandpaper through his chest. Still, he kept moving. Upstairs, Lyra remained mostly quiet. But Ethan noticed changes. Small ones. She no longer hid whenever customers entered downstairs. Sometimes she stood near the staircase listening to conversations while pretending to organize dishes. Other times, she helped package leftover bread into paper bags for late-shift workers who could not afford full meals. Nobody questioned it directly, yet people noticed. Humanity always noticed kindness eventually because most had spent too long without it. Near sunset, the station heating system failed again across half the lower district. Lights flickered overhead while warning sirens echoed faintly through the ventilation network. Outside, freezing rain turned into sharp pellets of ice, striking the bakery windows hard enough to sound like thrown gravel. Ethan cursed softly under his breath while checking the radiator pipes near the kitchen. Barely warm. They cut the auxiliary heat routes, Lyra said quietly from behind him. Ethan looked up. How do you know? Because they used the same pressure tactics during labor protests in the Valoran territories. Her silver eyes drifted toward the darkening windows. Punish the poor first. The frightened will police everyone else for you. Ethan leaned against the counter heavily. He hated that she understood the system so well. 10 minutes later, the first knock came at the bakery door. Then another, and another after that. Ethan frowned and crossed toward the entrance. Outside stood 3 exhausted miners wrapped in soaked station jackets. One held a little girl, maybe 7 years old, pressed tightly beneath his arm against the cold. Sorry to bother you, Ethan, the oldest man said awkwardly. Our heating grid went dead 30 minutes ago. Ethan glanced past them toward the neighboring apartments. More dark windows than light now. Families gathering blankets. Steam disappearing from frozen pipes. The station administrators had chosen their timing carefully. Come inside, Ethan said immediately. The men hesitated. We cannot pay much. Did not ask. Within another hour, nearly 20 people crowded inside the bakery. Families from nearby housing blocks. Elderly workers. Children wrapped in oversized coats while storm winds screamed through Sector 12 outside. Ethan kept the ovens running nonstop just to heat the room. Soup simmered beside fresh bread while exhausted people sat shoulder to shoulder around the worn wooden tables downstairs. Nobody laughed much, but nobody looked alone either. Lyra moved quietly through the crowd, carrying mugs of hot tea from table to table. At first, some people stared uncertainly at her turquoise skin and silver eyes. Then they noticed the way she crouched beside frightened children while speaking gently, or how she slipped extra bread to older miners pretending not to be hungry. Little by little, the tension disappeared. Humanity recognized itself in small acts before anything else. Ethan watched her from behind the kitchen counter while kneading another batch of dough. The bronze medal rested openly against her sweater now. Not hidden anymore. Not ashamed. Around 8 o'clock, heavy footsteps echoed outside the bakery again. This time the room fell silent immediately. Through the frosted windows, 2 station enforcement officers appeared beneath the neon lights. Dark uniforms, corporate insignia glowing red against their collars. Ethan felt every conversation stop behind him. The officers stepped inside without removing their coats. Cold air rushed into the warm bakery immediately. One of them scanned the crowded room with visible irritation. Sector 12 heat restrictions remain active until further review, he announced flatly. Unauthorized food distribution violates emergency allocation protocols. Ethan wiped flour slowly from his hands. People are cold. Not your concern. The officer's eyes shifted toward Lyra, standing near the children's table holding a tray of bread. Recognition hardened his expression instantly. Ah, he said quietly. There she is. The entire bakery went still. Ethan stepped forward automatically before he even thought about it. But before either officer could move farther inside, something unexpected happened. One of the miners stood up, then another, then the cargo mechanic from the tram rail. One by one, exhausted workers rose slowly from the bakery tables until a wall of tired human bodies stood between the officers and Lyra. Nobody shouted. Nobody threatened. They simply stood there together in the warm smell of bread and cinnamon while freezing rain hammered against the station outside. The older miner holding the little girl adjusted his worn jacket once before speaking softly. "Bakery is closed tonight." The officers left without another word. Not because they were afraid. Ethan understood people like that too well. They left because systems built on fear never expected ordinary people to stand together quietly. The bakery door closed behind them with a soft metallic click, and for several seconds nobody inside moved. Rain hammered the station windows while freezing wind rattled the old ventilation pipes overhead. Then slowly, the tension drained from the room. Somebody exhaled. A child started crying softly against her mother's shoulder. One exhausted miner sat back down hard enough to make the chair creak beneath him. Life returning in careful pieces. Ethan realized his hands were shaking slightly from adrenaline and fatigue. Lyra noticed too. She crossed the bakery silently, carrying a steaming mug of coffee, and placed it beside him on the counter without speaking. Her silver eyes searched his face briefly. "You should sit down," she said quietly. Ethan almost argued out of habit. Then a violent cough bent him forward before the words came out. The room fell silent again for an entirely different reason. Ethan braced one hand against the counter while trying to catch his breath. His lungs felt like broken glass tonight. Too many years underground. Too many winters breathing recycled dust because medicine cost more than rest ever did. When the coughing finally eased, he noticed several people watching him with the same expression. Worry. Human beings were not meant to carry each other alone for this long. "You idiot," came a rough voice from one of the tables. Ethan looked up. The older miner holding the little girl shook his head slowly. "You spent your inhaler money on freeing somebody, did not you?" Ethan rubbed a hand across his face tiredly. It seemed important at the time. A few weak laughs moved through the bakery. Small. Real. The kind people shared when surviving together mattered more than dignity. The old miner reached into his coat pocket first, then the cargo mechanic, then a tired woman from the housing blocks near the south tunnel entrance. One by one, people began placing small credit chips onto the bakery counter beside Ethan's coffee mug. Tiny amounts mostly. $5, $12, $20. Not charity. Survival pooled together the same way poor people had always survived when systems forgot they existed. Ethan stared at the growing pile speechless. "Heating grid comes back tomorrow," the mechanic muttered awkwardly. "You can pay us back in bread." Another laugh drifted through the room. This time, even Ethan smiled faintly. Across the bakery, Lyra stood perfectly still watching the scene unfold around her. Workers with worn boots and tired eyes giving away money they could barely spare because one exhausted baker had reminded them they were still human. Her fingers lifted slowly toward the bronze medal resting against her collarbone. For years that medal had represented memory, duty, loss. Tonight, for the first time, it meant something else. Hope. Hours later, the storm finally weakened outside Sector 12. Families returned carefully to their apartments carrying wrapped loaves of bread beneath their coats for warmth. One by one, the bakery emptied until only silence remained again. Ethan locked the front door near midnight while Lyra extinguished the overhead lights. The station beyond the windows still glowed cold and endless beneath layers of steel and steam. But inside the bakery, warmth lingered stubbornly in the walls. Ethan sank heavily into one of the kitchen chairs upstairs while rubbing exhaustion from his eyes. "I think half the station now believes I started a revolution," he muttered. Lyra stood beside the stove pouring fresh tea into chipped ceramic mugs. "Did you?" Ethan accepted the mug with a tired snort. "I just wanted people to stop freezing." "Sometimes," Lyra said softly. "That is how revolutions begin." Silence settled comfortably between them afterward. No fear inside it anymore. No chains. Just the quiet sound of rainwater dripping from station pipes and the distant hum of freight engines moving somewhere far below the colony. Ethan glanced toward the kitchen table where the bronze medal rested beside an unfinished loaf of bread. "You should keep it," he said quietly. Lyra looked at him. The medal. Ethan nodded. Not because of the government that gave it to you. He paused briefly. Because you survived what they became. Lyra stared at him for a long moment. Then slowly, carefully, she sat down across from him at the small kitchen table. Not on the floor. Not near the door ready to run. At the table. Like she belonged there. Ethan broke the remaining loaf in half and slid one piece toward her automatically. Outside the station windows, stars flickered faintly beyond the storm clouds hanging over the mining colony. Cold, distant, unreachable. But inside the bakery, warm bread steamed gently between two exhausted people who had almost forgotten kindness still existed in the galaxy. And for the first time in years, Lyra accepted food from another hand without feeling afraid afterward.